Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Pact. I am the P, Peter Coffin, the lovely Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor, Master of Science. Here is the ACD. Together we're Pact. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast service. Also, leave us a glowing review on Audible and Apple Podcasts. We are a 5-star podcast.
Not 4, not 3, 5. I'm a 5-star man.
Help us keep the lights on by becoming a patron at patreon.com/PactPod. Your monthly support gets you into our Discord servers, gets you exclusive content, and you see some content before anyone else. We've got fantastic Pact merch available as well. Finally, tell your friends. We rely so big on word of mouth. We stream 7 p.m. Eastern every Saturday. Thanks a ton for tuning in. We're really excited to have with us today Caleb Maupin and Fox and Alex of Space Commune. Thank you very much for all coming in today. There is a whole big Landback thing going on right now.
A regenerated discourse. This conversation has reemerged, it seems, among public leftist and or communist personalities.
I think, basically, this is a meme that started in 2018. It came about when a big hashtag trended. Landback ultimately started as an organization last year in 2020 on Indigenous Peoples Day. It's not actually a campaign that has gone back since the land has been stolen. It is a word that was come up with a couple of years ago. And now it's a big thing that all good commies support, right?
I think it would be good to start by analyzing what their proposed platform is, using their Landback manifesto from Landback.org. Landback is the reclamation of everything stolen from the original peoples. Something I think
nobody's angry about that.
All communists would support. This is something upon which we unambiguously agree.
Caleb, you've said that specifically on Twitter a bunch of times at this point.
Reclaiming land, language, ceremony, medicines, kinship, practices, as well as material land resources. It's a relationship with Mother Earth that is symbiotic and just, where we've reclaimed stewardship, moving towards liberation, sovereignty for Indigenous peoples through organizing, political and narrative framework, interconnecting our struggle with the land of all oppressed peoples, or with the struggles of all oppressed peoples, and composing a future where Black reparations and Indigenous land back coexist. That's great. As communists, we always champion the interests of the marginalized at the front of our communist movement. These are all goals towards which we would strive as communists, phrased in an albeit idealistic, non-materialist way to achieve these things. But of course, these are all things that we would support. If they worked towards these ideals in a way that was materially compatible with what they are advocating for. What they're advocating for is getting Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. Great. Dismantling white supremacy and systems of oppression, and getting to the roots of that by putting Indigenous lands in Indigenous hands. More than a campaign to do so, it's a meta-narrative that centers Indigenous people's experiences and their sovereignty. That's fantastic.
Great rhetoric.
Great rhetoric.
They make it hard to argue with.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, and rhetoric that everybody here, of course, agrees with because we're communists. And
in a literal sense, anyhow.
We want Indigenous people to have sovereignty where they once had it, to be reclaimed. That's fantastic. The unfortunate part about this and how Landback has been applied is that it has primarily been a movement to privatize public land under the guise of affording sovereignty to Indigenous people. One might ask, well, if we're taking U.S. public land, are we providing public land under the ownership of Indigenous peoples? That would ideally be what's happening. But what's happened thus far demonstrates that this land back movement is underpinned by corporate investments and the land that is given back, so to speak, to indigenous peoples, and thus with the material effects of further solidifying the class divisions between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat within indigenous populations. So, the effects of that are not championing native interests. In fact, it's doing the opposite and subjugating the proletariat of one of the most marginalized populations in the United States to even further conditions of inequity.
Great rhetoric, but it doesn't change the material base of the society that it exists in, and therefore it just further exacerbates the fundamental contradiction of capitalism.
And if it did actually challenge the material basis, then Jeff Bezos would not be funding it.
No.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be giving $12 million, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, the understanding that historically oppressed groups within the borders of the United States, but, the communists in the United States have historically said that they support, colonized groups within the USA establishing a national territory. The most popular example is the Black Belt, right? And that in the U.S. South, there's regions that are overwhelmingly, even to this day, majority African American. They're called the Black Belt because of the soil, actually, not because Black people live there. It's because the soil there is particularly rich. There were a lot of slave plantations there during the time of slavery. And the Communist Party raised the demand for self-determination for the Black Belt, arguing that if the Black people of that region wanted to separate from the United States and have their own national territory, if they wanted that, not declaring they should have it, but if they wanted that, communists would then support their right to it. And then later there came the support for the concept of the Sun Belt, or Etzlan, which is, in the Southwest United States, territory that was stolen from Mexico that is overwhelmingly majority Chicano, as well as in, North and South Dakota and other parts, other regions that are, indigenous areas and such. And the problem with all of that is it gets a little tricky because, if you're white and you're going around advocating what sounds like an ethno-state or sounds like separation, that can come across very confusing. There used to be a map the Communist Party had with the map of Black Belt, and it was, we support self-determination. But at that point, most Black people in the United States didn't want to have a separate state. So it's tricky. And again, if an oppressed group wants to separate from the country, communists have a responsibility to support that. But it's not clear that these oppressed groups actually want that. I don't think the majority of African Americans in the United States want to separate and form a separate state. So I don't go around advocating that as a white man because that sounds like separation. And the same for the Sun Belt and the Chicano people, the same for the indigenous groups. If they did want full-on separation and a national territory, again, I would support that, but I don't go around doing it on their behalf. The other thing, especially with indigenous groups in the United States, most of the people that I see on the internet advocating Landback, which, again, what is it? We're privatizing public land to give it to the control of indigenous tribes. Most of the people that I see on the internet advocating it are white. And among the indigenous community, look, I've been to Native American reservations, and there are a number of Native Americans who serve in the U.S. military, who are evangelical Christians, who vote for Republicans. So I don't think it's unanimous among indigenous people that they want to form a separate state, and they want territory to form a separate state. I don't think it's necessarily unanimous among them what that would even comprise. So I wouldn't feel comfortable going around advocating a separate state until I was sure that this was the overwhelming consensus among indigenous folks. And even then, I would advocate what they advocate. I wouldn't advocate what some nonprofit advocates, I guess. Yeah. And I guess this all gets tricky. But at the end of the day, yes, historically colonized people do have the right to their own territory, et cetera. But this Landback stuff, the way it's always presented to me is this is why you can't be a patriotic socialist. This is why you can't advocate 21st century socialism. Mm-hmm. We're all living on stolen land, and so you can't advocate, an economic program to dismantle imperialism here because we can't advocate, jobs and education. The most blatant example of this kind of thing I saw was during the teachers' strike in 2017, the West Virginia teachers' strike. They went on strike in West Virginia, and the Workers' World Party, which was a Marxist group that I had previously been a member of, they were dominated by Maoist Third Worldist elements, and they didn't support the teachers' strike on the grounds that the teachers' strike was taking place on indigenous land. And they actually wrote a manifesto on their website saying that instead of going on strike, these teachers in West Virginia should pay reparations to indigenous people. And then below it, they put a meme that said, "One settler, one bullet." And if you know the history of strikes in West Virginia and company thugs and gun thugs, that was just blatantly scabbing at that point. Now obviously the rest of the organization didn't agree with them, and there was some internal turmoil. But to see, this kind of Landback stuff being used as a justification for not supporting, all kinds of working class teachers going out on strike. I mean, that's an example of how kind of toxic this is, right? We should support indigenous people and their call if they want a separate territory, et cetera. But this idea that we cannot engage in class struggle because we're all a bunch of racist Euro settlers, and anyone who does is actually a white supremacist trying to prop up, that can be used to derail any progressive struggle, and that's why it's dangerous.
Sure. One of the things you said earlier that I want to connect back, but also return to what you had just said. There are people who haven't thought about this for longer than 3 seconds and are saying that, we're speaking on behalf of the indigenous community. No,
we're doing the opposite. We're saying these folks are doing that.
Exactly.
Well, that's I think what Caleb was hitting on is
exactly
alluding to this issue with the NGO industry, the nonprofit industrial complex, is that it makes it seem like it's representing groups of people when it's doing the exact opposite. It's handpicking specific people that say they represent a large group of the working class, but they don't at all. These people aren't elected. No one's choosing term limits for these people who are supposedly speaking for the marginalized groups. It's the exact opposite of a representational democracy. But the way they market themselves, the way this industry markets itself is that as if they're speaking for large groups of people. And then what happens is that messaging filters down to regular people who say, no, see, I read it in Elle magazine that the tiny house warriors got arrested, and they're the ones that are speaking for these groups, and I'm going to listen. As a white person, it's my job to listen, and this is where people's good nature gets taken advantage of by this giant nonprofit industrial complex.
Right, exactly, and that goes back to, Caleb, what you were saying towards the end of your comment. And that it further solidifies among the general public the narrative that to counteract this privatization of public land is being a racist white Euro settler.
Yeah.
Because you're not supporting what Amazon wants to do, what large real estate companies in Canada building luxury apartments, generating billions of dollars of rent want to do. That means that you're stepping on indigenous toes.
Well, the thing is, we have a common enemy, and that's what we're focusing on here.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Is not the indigenous people is we're trying to tell them what to do. We're saying we, as white people or whatever race or whatever your identity is, we have a common enemy. And that's the bottom line. And we're allowed to talk about that, and we should talk about that.
One thing also that's worth pointing out is that all over the world, and especially in South and Central America, the U.S. government and the UN, NGO, CIA apparatus likes to play this game of they pick their favorite indigenous folks as if they speak for all indigenous folks. Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, was the first indigenous president of Bolivia. He had an indigenous ceremony to swear him in. He wore indigenous clothing. He changed it to the plurinational state of Bolivia and changed their constitution to give sovereignty to indigenous groups. But U.S. media called him a dictator, called him a tyrant, said he was But then when he would want to build a road to bring jobs and economic development to indigenous areas, they would go, the U.S. media and the NGO apparatus at the UN would go and find an indigenous group that didn't believe in electricity, and didn't believe in running water, and hold them up and say, oh my God, the communists are oppressing the indigenous people. Well, I mean, Evo Morales himself was indigenous. He granted territorial integrity. He wiped out illiteracy in Bolivia, which was huge. He paved the roads of the country. He raised millions of indigenous people out of poverty. But he wanted to build a road, and the CIA found this group of indigenous folks who don't believe in roads, and they put them all over the TV. And look, he's oppressing the indigenous people. That would be kind of like saying that if the U.S. government was going to build a highway in Pennsylvania. They went and found the Amish people and put the Amish people on there and said, look, the Pennsylvanians don't believe in this. How dare you? You're bringing, I mean, all indigenous folks are not the same. And they play this game in Nicaragua. They are currently, and it's still on discussion, building a new canal that would counter the Panama Canal. Now, the USA controls the Panama Canal. So the USA, of course, doesn't like the fact that Nicaragua is in talks with the Chinese government about building a new canal that would counter it. So how have they countered it? They've found some indigenous group that would object. Even though the overwhelming majority of people in Nicaragua have indigenous heritage, even though the current Nicaraguan government is overwhelmingly supported by indigenous folks, they have found certain groups that they are able to then prop up and say, look, the indigenous people of Nicaragua don't want this canal. And this is a game that they like to play, and it's particularly dangerous. And there's other historical examples of this. And part of it flows from the problem that the way we've come to talk about imperialism is we don't talk about it in an economic sense. Imperialism, we talk about it as cultural imperialism, right? And that's understanding that imperialism is an economic system where countries are kept in poverty by monopolies and Western capitalism. It is holding back economic development. But when imperialism suddenly becomes, it's about preserving indigenous cultures, and it's and that is a shift of conversation. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, that's not what the Arab people want. That's not the beautiful way the Arab people are, that the white man is coming there. No, people in the Middle East want, modernization and human rights and economic development. And, ISIS and Al-Qaeda like groups, they don't represent the people of the Middle East, right? And that we have this narrative where it's like there's these beautiful people around the world who are living their beautiful indigenous ways. And no, when the British Empire went to India, it reinforced the caste system because it was a mechanism for keeping the people of India oppressed, right? And that are projecting this narrative where it's like development is somehow an attack on indigenous people around the world. That is a very, very white chauvinist thing to do. That is often used to prop up the economic relationship that keeps people in poverty. People want jobs. People want economic opportunities. They may value their own traditions and their own cultures, and that's fine. But economic development, jobs, healthcare, electrification, wiping out illiteracy, these things are not an attack on indigenous peoples by any means. But they are when socialist countries do it, according to the NGO.
Exactly. And the thing is, too, is with that is racial essentialism in itself, to imply that indigenous communities, they're inherently antagonistic towards this development and improvement of rights for their communities. And for the Landback proposed claims say, interconnectedness between the struggles of all peoples. I'm not assessing the validity of whatever standpoint is being presented forward by somebody. I care about what are the ramifications for imperialism and sustaining it in the United States, because that's what's actually materially important for the interests of indigenous peoples, other marginalized groups, and the entire international proletariat.
Yeah, I mean, concrete examples of those standpoints being exploited, like the Standing Rock protests from 5 years ago, which were funded heavily by giant foundations, including the Novo Foundation, resulted in the shutdown of that pipeline. And what people don't realize is that Warren Buffett, who funded a lot of the protesters, also owns a lot of the railroads and oil transportation on railroads in the country. So by shutting down that pipeline, it didn't pose any threat to him. It actually was helping his business. Another one recently was the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in the southeast United States. Another similar situation where Dominion Energy, which is this massive, massive energy company in that area, They got protested for their pipeline by Warren Buffett's various foundations. It distressed the company so much that Warren Buffett actually bought the company after the pipeline got shut down. He created a distressed asset. I mean, this is like CIA type stuff that we often assign to the CIA, but now it's being done by billionaires because they have more. A lot of cases, they have more power than a lot of states do. And the latest one is this one in Vancouver with the Squamish people that are building this luxury waterfront housing project, and it's the standpoint is going to be used that it's a green building. They're providing wealth to their nation, but it's going to be luxury development for 6,000 units. These giant towers in what's kind of an undeveloped part of Vancouver, and you can imagine like once these things get built, when movements for rent control and tenants' rights come up in Vancouver, Indigenous sovereignty and centering Indigenous people is going to be invoked to shut down those tenant movements. You want to take money out of the pockets of the Squamish people. So bolting Landback on top of this capitalist system that's driven by billionaires funding the nonprofit industrial complex. It's not the same. It's not the same as land reform, and I think that's why we have to keep hammering this point home. It's not the same thing.
That seems to be a major point of confusion here. Just to clarify, so everybody is on the same page. Somebody asked how Jeff Bezos is supporting Landback. How much did he give?
He gave $12 million.
He gave $12 million from his Earth Fund. $12 million specifically to the Indian Collective, which is the underpinning organization of the Landback campaign that started in the fall of 2020. This isn't like any kind of conspiratorial, like Charlie in the mailroom drawing connections. Jeff Bezos literally financially supports this publicly and outright.
Yeah, and maybe some people deploy that as like a thought-stopping thing, like, oh, well, if Jeff Bezos donates money to something, then it's bad. Right? Yeah. We're not saying that. It's the beginning of looking into it and saying, well, why would he do that? And then how does that influence the ideal in my head that I have of Landback versus concretely, materially, how the effect that money has on the movement, the sensibilities of the movement, and how it manifests itself in real life. That's what it's opening the door to. It's not to say, oh, well, it's shitty now because he donated to it. Like it's not the point.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people bump up. I've been witnessing this in like conversations, for a few years, over the course of the year when I've been talking to people about Landback, and they say, well, why is it bad that it's being funded by a billionaire? Just because it's funded by a billionaire doesn't discredit it. Liberals will always try to co-opt our movements. And that just sort of takes a shortcut around what Caleb was alluding to, and Alex gave great examples of, is that we need to look at the economic, underpinning of like why they're doing this. It's not because they're nice people. It's not because, culturally we all of a sudden we feel so bad about what the sins of what we've done in the past and we're paying penance. Like that's not how capitalists operate. They operate in what's in their best interest. And, maybe they do feel like they're killing two birds with one stone, and they're saying, oh, see, we're helping Indigenous people, and we're, the more important thing is that it's helping them their bottom line economically. And that's what motivates the whole system. The whole system, and the people who rise to the top are the ones who are the best at doing that. And the idea that they're just all of a sudden becoming saints and they just care about Indigenous people, it's convenient for them. It's a convenient way to just sort of say, well, we're going to do what we need to do. And also, by the way, you guys are going to love it because we're helping out these people who have been marginalized in the past. And the thing about land reform versus Landback is land reform is for everyone in the entire world. It's not just about a certain group of people who've been racialized or whatever. Land reform is for everyone. And that's what we're fighting for, right? We're not just fighting for specific groups of people. We're fighting for everyone.
Yeah. one thing that I would like to mention is that, I have brought up repeatedly how this is used to derail progressive struggles. And then I constantly get the response that never happens. And no, I mean, I've given the example of the West Virginia teachers strike. I'll also give the example of during Occupy Wall Street, endlessly. Occupy Wall Street was told that it was a racist colonialist movement because that land is already occupied. You're occupying land that was stolen from the indigenous people. So therefore, you can't call it Occupy Wall Street. You can't even have Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. And I had many arguments with folks from this kind of woke perspective who were arguing. They weren't just arguing the name was wrong, right? There were some people who started calling it Decolonize Wall Street because that was more woke or something. But it wasn't just that. It was that you're not allowed to have this protest Occupy Wall Street, and you're not allowed to demand things like jobs and healthcare and education because this is all on stolen land, and all of that would come at the expense of people in the developing world. So we just have to kind of sit around in a circle and feel bad or something. It's this derail that I've seen. And basically it leads to you can't have class struggle in the first world, especially not in the United States. We just kind of have to sit around and feel guilty about the fact that that we are living on land and that there was a genocide of Native people. Well, I'm all for acknowledging that history. I'm all for talking about how the United States as it currently exists is very much the product of genocide and murder and also slavery and et cetera. But what do we do now? I mean, we have to be able to develop a class struggle program to get beyond this. And we have a responsibility to do that. And the Landback thing just pretty quickly turns into you're not allowed to put forward a class struggle program. Because we should all just kind of feel bad. And it's just like, at that point, I mean, it's just a derail. I mean, I can imagine, what if women were demanding the right to vote? You could say, oh, they're going to give legitimacy to the settler government of the United States on stolen land, right? Black people want civil rights. Oh, they want to be equal partners in the settler regime set up by, I mean, it's like, this is just a derail. You can't really do anything. And then people make parallels to the Palestinian struggle. Now, this is very interesting. They'll say, oh, well, you wouldn't say that, about the Palestinians, you wouldn't tell a Palestinian not to want their land back. Well, if you look at what the Palestinians want, right, there is a two-state solution and there's a one-state solution. The one-state solution is not that all Israelis get deported immediately. It's rather that they get equal rights, right? It's that all people living in Palestine get equal rights. There's one state where all the people there get equal rights. It's not mass deportation. It's just people getting equal rights. The two-state solution is there then emerge two states, a Palestinian state and the Israeli state remains. But there is no call for mass deportation of all the Israelis. And, in South Africa, against the settler regime there, they didn't deport all white people. Nelson Mandela didn't deport all white people from South Africa. There has been redistribution of land in Zimbabwe after Rhodesia was dismantled. There's still lots of white people living in Zimbabwe. Just some of the farmland has been redistributed. But no, this idea that we basically should advocate all white people being deported from the United States, and unless we advocate that, we're racist and we're all white supremacists or something, that's ridiculous. But it's this internet meme that has developed, which is an excuse for abstention, and it's a way to attack those who want to develop an actual program to get us beyond and actually dismantle this capitalist and imperialist system. And it feels really woke, and it feels really, really revolutionary. But at the end of the day, you're basically saying, oh, we can't struggle. We just have to just sit around and feel bad. And that's a derail, and it's not helpful.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the important thing in relation to what you're saying is that this is contextualized within the past few episodes that we're doing. The working class in the United States is not the primary contradiction to the global proletariat. The American working class are not beneficiaries of American imperialism, and definitionally are antagonistic, and interests are diametrically opposed to what the bourgeois state of the American empire advocates for. This conversation about Landback is operating within that context, and that this is a collective struggle within which American workers are included and must necessarily be included to create conditions for an international proletarian movement. Something that is really curious to me, it seems like some people kind of downplay the role that Twitter has in political discourse, and they're like,
It's
you're
just
talking
Twitter.
about something, talking about Twitter.
Log
We
off
live
and
in the
touch grass.
21st fucking century. What's communicated politically on Twitter is one of the most relevant things that you could focus on. And any of the people supporting the communist movement in these critical, like, pioneer communist texts would be using Twitter were it available to them.
Which, by the way, would be phenomenal.
Yeah.
Lenin on Twitter? Oh my God.
That is a mode of disseminating information to billions of people. And to act like that is unimportant is the most naive, stupid thing I could possibly think of.
Well, it's like,
Not that, I mean, of course, tweeting's not revolutionary. It doesn't do
No.
anything. But like, to ignore what the discourse on Twitter reflects in a very real way is a grave error.
It's
Yeah.
a free website that's worth billions of dollars. So
Yeah, exactly.
That's why.
It's information infrastructure.
it's like how people have criticized Caleb's book, BreadTube,
Yes,
Serves
exactly.
Imperialism, where they're like, why are you talking about BreadTube? It's like, these people are like the biggest, quote unquote, leftist and or socialist influencers and personalities and entertainers out there. Like, why wouldn't you talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh my
absolutely. I mean, it's weird, I mean, there's all these little tiny communist groups that are always writing books against each other. Am I going to write a book about the Spartacist League or the Revolutionary Communist Party or something? Why not write about somebody that's got a far bigger audience? This is where the discourse is, and if we don't intervene in that discourse, then we don't get to impact it in any way. And the fact that we've gotten such a strong response indicates that we are making an impact. If we didn't get such an extreme hostile response to what we did, it would mean that they didn't care. It would mean it wasn't having an impact. There's obviously forces that are very threatened by what we're doing here, and that's why we got to keep doing it.
Yeah, I think the top
Exactly.
space commune video is what the fuck is BreadTube?
Yeah.
People act like Lenin didn't go to the effort of quote tweeting people in the middle of foundational scientific texts. Yeah, that's all of state and
Yeah,
revolution.
basically, State and Rev is him quote tweeting Kotsky repeatedly. and I think it's really important to understand that land reform, again, is not what anyone here is arguing against, but rather Landback, which is an intellectual property, a brand that is owned by a nonprofit that is funded by billionaires like Jeff Bezos. And to understand why it matters to resist that sort of thing, you have to see the fruits of it. And for instance, the serfs are everyone's favorite streamers.
I call him Surfing USA.
So the serfs was touting this Landback project in Canada to argue against the idea that Landback is about ethno-states. Now, there's I think it's pretty obvious that nobody here is arguing that Landback creates ethno-states.
We just presented in the beginning, based off of Landback.org stated propositions, that those are all unambiguous agreements among communists.
Which, again, we read directly from Landback.org's manifesto. We are not arguing against any kind of a straw man here. Anyway, the results of this type of thing are this. And I'm just going to read a single tweet from the serfs. Landback has absolutely nothing to do with ethno-states. It's about honoring the original treaties signed between indigenous people and colonizers. You know what the Squamish Nation did with their historic victory in Vancouver? Build low-income green housing for everyone. I think it is important to really get into some of the nitty-gritty into what this actually is. So the Senok project, which is this housing project that they've started, they announced it a few days ago, actually. They haven't built it, for one. And for two, it is about building 6,000 homes, 950 of them being affordable, quote unquote, which we don't have a definition as to what affordable specifically means here either.
Well, 950 of 6,000 homes being affordable.
Yeah. So it's not about them being affordable. The project intends to bring in $10 billion in rental revenue. This was what the Squamish Nation said after years of legal battles to win back this land. When we won the land back, ding, they said the name of the movie.
It's the titular line.
It is. It's the titular line. When we won this land back, because of the proximity to the downtown area, it makes sense as an economic development project, which, as we all know, is a real estate project. And people say, well, that's fine. Let all this money go to the Squamish Nation. Like that's good, right? Well, does it just immediately go to every single person in the Squamish Nation? No, of course it doesn't. There's a government set up that is managing this, and it's not specifically just going to the Squamish Nation. They are partnering, which is actually what I said. When Landback came up on Twitter, my reaction was they're privatizing the land so that large capital entities can either buy or partner with native governments in order to profit. And that's ultimately what's happening here. Westbank Corporation, which is Canada's leading luxury residential and mixed-use real estate development company, is partnering to construct the Senok housing development project. Now, the interesting thing about this, one of the selling points on the Senok website is that the reserve land with the Squamish Nation in the driver's seat has no drawn-out approvals or permitting delays. So the Squamish Nation don't have the regulatory oversights that anyone else in the entire area has. They're not accountable to the regular processes that a real estate developer would be. Now, that's very convenient for their new partners, the Westbank Corporation, who would normally have to operate in that framework. This ultimately just creates a situation where capital has so many advantages based entirely on Landback as the NDN collective has put forward occurring. Now, that doesn't mean that land reform is bad. That means that this specific thing, Landback, is ultimately a different thing from what land reform is. $10 billion of revenue, it's not going to suddenly make everybody of the Squamish Nation rich. That's not how that works. We haven't changed the material base. Yeah, exactly. It's not.
It further solidifies the class divisions among the Squamish Nation and other indigenous communities within which these partnerships are applied.
The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is socialized production maintaining the feudal appropriation method. And that hasn't been changed. The outside economy that surrounds this doesn't change. The only thing that changes is that now the Squamish Nation, which will be led by an elected body, which will benefit specifically, there's a bourgeoisie of that will benefit specifically from this, and Westbank Corporation now operate with special privileges. They're able to operate in a manner that they can profit easier, they can build easier, they don't have to deal with the same kind of regulatory oversight. That's what Landback is versus land reform.
I mean, Landback's also about going to a Native American casino and losing all your money at the roulette table. I mean, I think that's decolonizing yourself as well. Like, to say that like Landback in practice means building this giant luxury tower where, the Squamish people are going to become the largest landlord in Vancouver, and a bank is fronting all the money because the bank is thrilled that there's a way to build these giant towers to make, the project recently was doubled in size. It originally was 3,000 units. It was doubled in size to 6,000 because they realized they've created this legal framework that's going to help, Westbank improve its image. It's going to help the Canadian state improve its image, righting some kind of wrong. But
right, we're helping the marginalized.
Wasn't this an episode of King of the Hill where they get John Redcorn to open a casino?
Yeah.
But they're actually like developers who just tricked him into like using his native identity to like just like grab the land basically and then like screw him over. We should all rewatch that as a lesson in all this.
It fits into a wider problem, which is, we can criticize aesthetics here a little bit. There is a notion in a lot of left-wing circles that economic growth is somehow bad, right? That basically the indigenous communities, because they didn't have technology, they were pure, and economic growth is bad, and we want to get back to nature and get back to Mother Earth, and that's a very, very dangerous narrative. That's a Malthusian narrative, and ultimately socialism is about growth. It's about eliminating poverty. It's about industrialization. It's about electrification. It's about heading to the future and creating a greater abundance, so that the differences between classes can break down, the need for the state can fade away, and that kind of fetishization of things that one considers to be primitive or backward, that is not healthy by any means. And that is actually a Nazi aesthetic that was inserted in left circles.
Right. It's racial essentialism. It's Malthusianism under the guise of being promoting of his native interests.
And it's this noble savage trope. It's regarding like native people as somehow magical for some reason. Like they have this special relationship with the earth thanks to their native blood, which like, why would we want to be promoting that? I can't even imagine how people are incapable of interrogating these points down to that.
One of the things that I keep thinking about this when I think about it in the larger context, in the separation between this, NGO and movement and land reform and that sort of thing, is it kind of reminds me of Black Lives Matter in that, like, of course, like all communists support that sentiment and we support the movement unambiguously. No. We're all protesting. We all want these things for police brutality and the prison industrial complex, the special bodies of armed men that comprise the police and disproportionately harm people of color in our communities. Those are all things that we support. That does not mean that we support Black Lives Matter as an organization that became a Joe Biden voting promotion block, and funded, the
funded by Peter
multi-billion
like
dollar
the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation put, what was it, $2 billion into the Black Lives Matter nonprofit ecosystem, and that was like about a fifth of the money that went in that year. There was a lot of money that went into BLM via these nonprofits, and then you end up seeing the founders of these nonprofits buying $1.2 million houses in LA and retiring from the organization. And it's like, well, what was the point of this? Was it really to advance that agenda?
Look at where we were in the spring and summer of 2020 and where we are now.
Exactly.
Well, they're the same thing, right? They're perfect examples of how the capitalist class will extract all of the talking points and all of the narratives that don't actually threaten them from our movements. And they'll use those to say, you can't argue with us. This is what we stand for. And it's this like reversal where they just take all these talking points. And what we need to do is recognize when that happens and say, you know what, that is what I believe, but I know that you're using that, for your bottom line. And I'm not going to fall for it. I saw someone in the chat say, you're arguing against a name. And it's like, you're arguing for a name.
Exactly.
Landback is just a brand at this point. It's a name. It's a meme.
It's intellectual property. You said to me the other day.
Yeah. What does it stand for? Are good things happening for working people in the name of Landback, or are good things happening for the capitalist class in the name of Landback? At a certain point, we have to say, well, you know what? This phrase, this slogan, this maybe before it was co-opted, it was a way to rally people, but it became detached from all economic reality. And people say, oh, well, you're a class reductionist if you want to talk about how this is connected back to, an economic root. Who else are class reductionists? Are the capitalist class. They know what is like best for their class. And they're going to leverage the shit out of anything that they can to maintain their class interests.
Yeah, that is a dialectical view of this. Society is always in flux. We can't just assume that something is going to be the same thing tomorrow. Conditions continually change every day, day to day. Everything is different. It is all fluid. You can't just separate this issue off unto itself. You can't just cordon it off and make it its own discrete issue that we solve by, I guess, walking down the street with signs every once in a while. We have to actually understand that it ties itself back into the fundamental class contradiction of society, the owners and the workers. It is ultimately always going to come back to that, because once somebody owns something, like let's say you take public land and privatize it and put it in the hands of a class of the people who maintain or organize or govern the Squamish Nation or whatever indigenous tribe you're talking about. Once you put it into those hands, those people own and control it. And those people will use it in a manner that befits the economic base around them. It has nothing to do with their own morals. It has nothing to do with their identity. It has nothing to do with that. This is the way that society operates currently. The economy operates this way. And it's not attempting to stop these people from attaining sovereignty or stopping them from attaining self-direction. Like, in fact, it's the opposite of that. We want that for all of the indigenous people. We don't want it for some of the indigenous people, the leaders. We don't want it for the government. We don't want it for a capitalist class. We certainly don't want it for existing capital that headquarters outside of an indigenous nation and partners with that elite in order to create a specific set of conditions that they can profit from. That is the ultimate argument here, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. You know, this is part of the reason the organized left in the United States is so weak, is because of this tendency that I would call movementism, to just go along with whatever is trendy in left-wing circles. Hey, oh, look, Landback is trending. Let's not look at what they're actually, advocating, whatever. It's a group of indigenous folks, in theory, that are wanting this. And so we just kind of go along with it. And that is a big problem. And that's why I would argue that many of the communist groups are very, very weak, and they really just don't. They just kind of go along with whatever is trendy.
And it's rooted in this individualistic authoritarianism that's promoted by anarcho-communists who just want to feel good about supporting whatever people are saying communists support.
I think fandom is another good word to describe these dynamics, that people, like you said, Caleb, like the movementism, people like the idea of a movement. They like consuming the content where they see, insert identity here. The person standing, giving a speech and saying, "Oh, this powerful voice, like this is going to change everything." Like, people want to support that so badly, and they do, and that's why people are charged up about it.
Edward Bernstein, the first revisionist, his slogan was, "The movement is everything, but the goal is nothing." And that was a way to move away from the revolutionary part of Marxism. We just, the movement, just follow the movement. Well, and we live in an era
where... What does that mean?
Yeah.
The movement is largely co-opted. It's funded by the Ford Foundation and NGOs and nonprofits and Jeff Bezos and George Soros and no,
the Rockefellers.
And just because the movement is doing something doesn't mean we should just go along with it. And what that ultimately leads is to disillusion. It leads to actual Marxism becoming weak and unknown and insignificant, because people just kind of go along with whatever the movement is saying. So we need to be having these conversations, and that this dualism that people get in their mind. You're criticizing the movement, therefore you're with the right. You're criticizing Landback, therefore you're a white supremacist. You disagree with Black Lives Matter Incorporated, therefore you're with Blue Lives Matter and the police. No, I mean, it's like they can't understand that there's nuance to all of these things, and that
they can't think dialectically.
Yeah, it's all just kind of either or. You're with them or you're against them. There's a fight in our ruling class right now between the ultra rich, I would argue, the Eastern establishment, the entrenched interests, the ultra monopolists, and the lower levels of capital that have a more libertarian approach. And we should be studying these differences among the ruling class and maneuvering to put forward an independent working class agenda, not simply tailing after one side that happens to put out a more progressive message.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that this all comes from this idea of like self-sacrifice, right? This idea that like we all need to just lay our bodies down because we're inherently bad and guilty and white, and like that's such bullshit. Like we want to be invested in a fight that's gonna improve the life for everyone, including ourselves. Otherwise, what are you doing? You're just sort of laying your body down as this noble sacrifice.
Which is an ineffective strategy and won't work for advocating for that specific group anyway.
Right, because you're never going to get like the majority of like regular working class Americans to just say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to just lay down and kowtow to whatever small minority group that wants these things. The thing is like, and that is a thought terminating thing too, because it says that like, our struggles are the same, like you can see the same struggles that happen within the indigenous communities happen within every community, and we should strive to see the parallels, that we're all fighting the same battles, and that, you know, there might be different little variables here and there, and, you know, history creates different sort of struggles. You know, the terms for each struggle are slightly different for each group, but at the end of the day, we're all fighting that same struggle, and we should be looking at that and saying the fight for indigenous sovereignty is the same as the fight for working class, you know, sovereignty, and no matter what race you are. It's like,
well, no, we're colonizers. This is five colonizers debating the self-determination attempt of the colonized.
It's a bad luck.
I've literally never left the continent in my entire life. I was born and raised in this continent. What did I fucking settle? You know, where do I go back to? Do I cut my body in half and go to like 5 different countries in Europe? Like,
you have to get your blood quantums read so you can figure out where your pieces need to go.
I want to clarify that I actually obtained all of my information from comrade number 3.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is comrade number 3. 1, 2, 3. That's it. That's the argument. No, stop. I win the debate.
And comrade number 3 is an indigenous person that agrees with me. So, argument over. Yeah, colonizer Peter is stuck in Michigan for like a week because they couldn't pay to get back here.
I literally didn't have any money at all.
Well, it must be nice.
Yeah, it must be nice, colonizer Peter.
Exactly. That's how to be a good and pure communist, is to literally have $4.85 in your bank account.
Like, if you need to say that we don't believe that to argue against us, that means you need to reinterrogate why you're actually arguing with us. Do you want these things for indigenous people, or do you want to feel good? Do you want to feel better than white people? Do you want to diminish your own white guilt if you are white? Why are you arguing with us when we're supporting the interests of Native people? I do not understand.
Because it's the trendy thing, right? This is the trendy thing. Social media said this is the hip, cool, left-wing thing to do, and we're disagreeing with it, so we must not be hip and cool. And we've said over and over and over again that we advocate self-determination for indigenous people, etc. But we're clearly disagreeing with the hip, cool, trendy thing to do, so we must be the bad guys. And it's really sad that this is how a low level of political engagement that people are at. I mean, there's more to this than that. I mean, I believe people can do better than that. You know, the number of people who watch my streams have said, yeah, you know, I mean, I like that you bring a higher level of discourse here. You teach me something I don't know. You know, I mean, this is where it's at. A lot of times politics is almost like baseball or football. You know, it's like, you know, what team is doing this today? I mean, it's like, no, there's deeper concepts here. There's deeper history. There's deeper, you know, meaning here. This is not simply, you know, what the red team is doing against the blue team this week.
I think that people are hungry for this, and they can sense something is wrong, and they're looking for answers. And what happens is they end up going on social media to connect with people who have answers, and then they get filtered into like BreadTube and whatever, you know, leftist influencers who seem to be, you know, Peter, we were talking about this, people who seem to be independent and not, you know, funded by anything. They're just people, you know, on their webcam or whatever, just talking to their parasocial pals. And they don't realize that so much stuff on the internet, all these people, all these influencers are like, there's a reason why they have like 10,000 followers or 1 million subscribers. You don't get like famous, you don't get wealthy from criticizing these things. You get that from towing the line.
You make yourself useful, ultimately.
Right.
And like, there's somebody that I used to work with who, at around the same time, about a year ago, I got approached and they got approached by an NGO to include some talking points in a video. I said no, because ultimately you can't go back to saying, I don't take money. And they didn't. They took the money. They took a couple of grand to include, honestly, just some CDC statistics and some NYT stuff, and nothing particularly out there, but you do have to reorient your other content to not contradict these things. Otherwise, you include this stuff and it just seems like totally out of place. So you have to adjust your content to make sense for that. And this happened, and I watched it happen, and I don't work with this person anymore. I don't talk with them anymore. But like it's interesting to me how this type of stuff can happen. I don't take money from these NGOs. I don't take money from anything.
Just from me.
Yeah, I do take your money. I take your card. I go to the store and I buy tons of Monster energy drinks
and colonize Walmart.
Yeah, I go colonize Walmart.
Well, it's about pushing narratives, right?
Yes.
And they're not, and that's why the narratives of these BreadTube channels get less and less radical. And the inconsistencies you pointed out, once people start becoming really inconsistent, their viewers say, wait a minute, you were saying this, 6 months ago, what's going on? So in order to like not undermine their own authority, they have to sort of, their narratives become less and less and less and less critical of capital over time, which is why you see somebody like ContraPoints, who was pretty sharp a few years ago, had some pretty decent critiques, but now, she's just a total lib. I mean, she's like,
literally citing Helmut Schuck, who is an anti-communist, literally said that Karl Marx was
right. Now she's applying individualist
the result of
to
individuals not being able to handle their envy.
Yeah.
And this is not to like criticize people for needing to, I don't want to attack anybody for taking this route, because this is just the route that's incentivized in our society. And if you need to take money and your life's going well, you have no reason to not do that. And I can't fault these people individually, but it's important for us to all talk about how this dynamic works. And it's not about canceling individuals. It's about understanding how these individuals are pressured and how their narratives change. And for you, the audience, to understand it through that lens.
Yeah. And the money ties into something where these creators and a lot of the places where people spend time being communists or anarchists online, we get further and further away from the history of how socialist, communist movements actually happen. That's Caleb. That's why I like watching your stuff. Is that I always learn something. I mean, like in the Chinese Revolution, I was reading this book the other night that talked about how they didn't need allyship. They didn't need to have allyship to the farmers of China. The farmers themselves, they viewed their individual land ownership as a lifeblood for themselves that they were entitled to. That's the reason why they followed the revolution. Land reform happened in China because farmers were incentivized to they were like, oh, I will get land. So, I mean, how is land reform going to happen in the United States? It's not going to happen through allyship. It's going to happen through everyone, realizing that they have something at stake and that we can all gain something from it.
I think now is a good time. Let's maybe get everybody's rounding out comments on this subject.
Well, sure. I mean, I just want to add that, after 9/11, Fox News went into an overdrive against a Native American scholar named Ward Churchill. And me being a teenager who was revolutionary and anti-war, I thought, I'm going to go check this guy out. So I read Ward Churchill, this Native American scholar from the University of Colorado. I read his book on the justice of roosting chickens, his essay, Some People Push Back, and his work seemed really, really revolutionary. But the message of the work was basically that all white Americans are Euro settlers and colonizers and exploiters, and that 9/11 was somehow just vengeance against us for our evil crimes. I look back on that. I was very angry and kind of in a teenage edgelord state, so I liked it. But I look back on that and I realize how wrong that narrative really was. And then I found out that Ward Churchill is a CIA operative, that he went to Nicaragua with Russell Means to make propaganda against the Sandinistas to kind of, try and incite indigenous groups in Nicaragua to fight against the Sandinista government. And then on top of that, I now realize that narrative that all the working class people in the United States are all a bunch of exploiters and they need to have a lower standard of living and all of that. That's what the highest levels of capital think, as they're trying to collapse the United States into an open international system, set up a global apparatus of production and drive down wages and living standards. So there's a reason that Ward Churchill is one of the top Native American scholars in the United States. He's pushing a narrative that is really in service of neoliberalism. And of course, he stands against any genuine communist movement you'll ever see around the world. In Latin America, in India, wherever communists are actually organizing and fighting for workers' rights, he finds an excuse for it to be racist or Western or whatever, and he opposes it. And that's the toxicity of the synthetic left. And I just wanted to share that as kind of a way to put this whole conversation in perspective, because at the end of the day, if we're not struggling, if we're not bringing forward a program, an economic program to improve people's lives and build unity among all working people around that program to improve the needs of people's lives, to put the needs of historically marginalized and oppressed groups at the front, but unifying all workers around that program, if we're just kind of doing something else, we're not really serving our ultimate aim, which is dismantling the global system of imperialism and monopoly capitalism, and eliminating scarcity and poverty, and moving toward a stateless, classless world of vast material abundance. That book you guys read, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, is one of the most important books in the history of Marxism. I'm really glad you read it, because it flies in the face of so much of what synthetic left elements believe. It is one of the most important books out there, so I'm glad you gave it a study.
Thank you.
Fox?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the thing that I hope people take away from this is to recognize when somebody is trying to shut down your own thought process on something, right? And saying, you're not allowed to talk about this, shut up and listen. And for that to always be sort of a red flag for you, and say, you know what, when somebody's telling me not to talk about something, when somebody's telling me not to think about this, when it's not my position to talk or think about any of this stuff, then you're onto something, right?
Yeah. And
we all have the internal skills. We all have the critical thinking skills to figure this stuff out. It's not impossible. It's not, I mean, they give us a lot of like smoke and mirrors, and they have a lot of money behind these PR campaigns. But I think people inherently understand when there's something wrong. And my friend Emmett Penny, he says, always look at how it works and who benefits, right? And I think that's a really good sort of motto, is always analyze these things and say, how is this working and who's benefiting at the end of the day? Because that's what's important, right? It's not about projecting your morals or making sure people know you're a good person. If you know you're a good person, that's what's important. Don't ever let people shut down your own critical thinking skills.
I like it.
And Alex.
Yeah, I think following the money can seem like the ultimate black pill, because it seems like obviously everything is in a state of flux, where there are different relationships and different incentives that classes of people have, groups of people have. So just, as you're following the money, you just can't let it be a thought terminating thing where you decide that everything is hopeless. And I think that's where studying history is really important, and seeing that movements, by having a high level of rigor and analysis and discourse about things, and being able to talk about things and not getting triggered that your favorite movement is being questioned for who it takes money from or how that money affects the ideology. Really having the courage to look at things that you support, and seeing what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, and figuring out how to talk to other people about how to move forward with that.
Absolutely.
No, thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for doing this. It's really appreciated. Let's go around and do your social media.
All right. I'm Caleb Maupin, CalebMaupin. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Twitter. I'm going to be on Twitch pretty soon. So yeah, I'm doing everything I can. I got a website, calebmaupin.com. So yeah.
You have a new podcast too.
Yes. Well, yeah, with the podcast, the Center for Political Innovation, it's now in podcast form on Spotify and on Google Podcasts, I guess. If you go to cpiusa.org for the Center for Political Innovation, you can hit media podcasts, and you can get all of this in podcast form.
Yeah, I mean, we have a website, spacecommune.com, that has all of our content on there. We have a podcast. We do videos. Yeah, I don't know.
What's your Twitter handle, Fox?
Yeah.
You can follow me at drill. No, just kidding.
Drill.
DRIL. You can follow my shit posts, Fox G Green on Twitter.
And I'm Alex SPCM on Twitter.
And then there's also @SpaceCommune. Thanks again, everybody, for showing up. If you post Twin Rabbit onto your social media, you're automatically discredited. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Comrade number 3.
Forever.
That's all for today. Thanks again for watching or listening. This is Pact. I'm Peter. This is Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. To help us out, click like, follow, subscribe, whatever. Leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Audible. To support us, become a patron at patreon.com/PactPod. That's PACDPOD. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.